Great. Good morning, everyone. Wow, this is great. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. So this is what it feels like to come together in person. This is what people do. They network, they talk. I love it. Thank you so much for everyone coming down to 640 today. Welcome to Georgetown. My name is Uwe Brandis. I'm the faculty director of the Georgetown Global Cities Initiative. The Global Cities Initiative is a horizontal interdisciplinary dialogue at the university. It's housed in the Office of the President, and it seeks to engage all members of the Georgetown community and beyond in the important issues associated with global urbanization. We couldn't do this without being engaged in our own city. It's absolutely necessary for us to be engaged in our own city as members of our Georgetown community go out and explore urban issues around the world. And I'm so excited for everyone to come together in this dialogue today on this extremely important and timely issue. I'd like to just offer that my own personal engagement in this issue has brought me to Georgetown. I, for many years, was engaged as a member of Mayor Williams's team working on the Southeast Federal Center. So we know these issues for sure have to do with buildings and real estate, but that's really just the beginning. This is a very interdisciplinary dialogue. I'm extremely excited and thankful for all of our guests here to explore this issue with us. I'd like to just thank a number of organizations for their support in helping pull this together. The Georgetown Urban and Regional Planning Program, the Georgetown Real Estate Program, the Georgetown Department of Government, the McCourt School of Public Policy, the Georgetown Project on State and Local Government Policy and Law at the Georgetown Law Center, the Georgetown Capital Applied Learning Labs, and the Federal Real Property Association. Thank you to all. I'd also like to thank Katie Weichert and the entire team here at SES for helping organize this event and allowing us to convene so smoothly. Special thanks to Norman Dong for organizing the panel. Norman's on our faculty and actively teaching about this issue. And a very special thank you to all of our speakers and special guests. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Bella Walken, a master's candidate at the McCourt School of Public Policy, who will do the introductions.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all here this morning. Nani A. Coloretti is the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, where she works on issues across the federal government to fund and implement the President's agenda to improve the lives of all Americans. Ms. Coloretti previously served as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and as Budget Director for San Francisco City and County. She holds a BA in Economics and Communications from the University of Pennsylvania and an MPP from the University of California, Berkeley. Tony Williams is the former mayor of Washington, D.C. from 1999 to 2007 and is the Chief Executive Officer of the Federal City Council. Before election as mayor, he was the independent Chief Financial Officer of the district from 1995 to 1998. Working with and on behalf of local officials, the DC Financial Control Board, and U.S. Congress. Tony was the first CFO for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, appointed by President Bill Clinton. He has served as the William H. Bloomberg Lecturer in Public Management at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He holds a BA from Yale, an MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School, and a JD from the Harvard Law School. He was distinguished with the 2020 Prize for Visionaries in Urban Development by the Urban Land Institute. Marcel Acosta is the Executive Director of the National Planning Commission, the National Capital Planning Commission, which is the federal government's central planning agency. The National Capital Planning Commission provides long-term planning guidance for federal land and buildings in the region. Before joining NCPC, Marcel served as Senior Vice President of Planning and Development for the Chicago Transit Authority and as Deputy Commissioner for the Chicago Department of Planning and Development. He received a master's in urban and regional planning from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was appointed a Loeb Fellow of Advanced Environmental Studies at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Keith Cunningham is Assistant Director for Physical Infrastructure at the Government Accountability Office, the investigative and audit arm of the U.S. Congress. Mr. Cunningham's recent work on federal real property includes reports on various issues related to property ownership, realignment, leasing, disposal, and financing. Prior to government service, Mr. Cunningham directed research on worldwide military base closure and reuse efforts for the Bonn International Center for Conversion. Mr. Cunningham holds a Master's of Policy Studies from Johns Hopkins University and a BS in Social Science from Miami University, Ohio. Peter Otteni serves as Executive Vice President and co-head of the Washington, D.C. region for BXP, formerly known as Boston Properties. Prior to his appointment to this position in May 2021, Mr. Otteni served as Senior Vice President of Development. He was responsible for more than 4 million square feet of real estate development in Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, and Maryland. Mr. Otteni receives a BS in Commerce from the University of Virginia and an MBA from the University of North Carolina, Keenan Flagler Business School. Norman Dong is a partner at FD Stonewater and a member of the faculty and the Georgetown Urban and Regional Planning Program. Mr. Dong is the former commissioner of the GSA Public Building Service, acting controller at Office of Management and Budget, and chief financial officer of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. In addition to his federal experience, Mr. Dong served as deputy mayor for operations and as city administrator for the District of Columbia. He holds a bachelor's degree from Yale University and a master's degree from the Harvard University John F. Kennedy School of Government.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the program. Today, we're talking about the impacts, the urban impacts of underutilized federal real estate. And as you look at this issue, it seems like this has been a chronic problem over the past decade or even longer. So what we want to do today is just kind of explore the issue, talk about the urban impacts, and talk about how we might think about managing the federal portfolio differently as we move forward. But I wanted to start with a little bit of history and context and talk about kind of the importance of federal facilities to our urban areas. Many of you in the room may be familiar with Executive Order 12072. Which dates back to the Carter administration. And it emphasizes the importance of locating federal facilities in urban areas to help strengthen cities and to make them attractive places to live and work. And we've seen examples of this across the country and here in Washington. So I wanted to start a little bit by kind of going back in time. I see a lot of younger faces in the audience that weren't here back in the 90s or before. I'm looking here at Monica. For those who are new or relatively new to the district, I want to just kind of like set the scene in terms of what the district was like 20, 30 years ago and talk about the impact that federal location decision-making has had in terms of the revitalization of the district. You were here, you got here back in 1993. DC was, yeah, that's what I said. Why don't you talk about what things were like and how the impact that we saw in terms of federal agencies locating in these emerging neighborhoods?
Well, I apologize if some of you have never heard my shtick. But, you know, my whole shtick was when I came to office as mayor, I had worked in, well, you know what, I was a student at Yale. I was on the Board of Aldermen in New Haven. New Haven's a struggling city, number one. And number two, New Haven had the whole history of urban renewal, and Ed Lowe, great book about him, came out a couple years ago. I had worked in the Boston Redevelopment Authority for a crazy man, brilliant man named Steve Coyle, and the Boston Redevelopment Authority is a very powerful land disposition agency created by Ed Lowe. All the west end of Boston, for better or worse, where Mass General is, that's the work of the Boston Redevelopment Authority. So I really had a sense of the moment for Washington, D.C. Number one, that we were on the bottom of a trough, but we had tremendous potential. You know, I had seen what the presence of facilities could do in general, and federal facilities in particular could do. You know, I've done a lot of reading. I urge all of you to read The Empire Express. It's the greatest book on the Transcontinental Railroad that's been written to date. Now, why do I mention the Transcontinental Railroad? Because actually, the Transcontinental Railroad, notwithstanding its negative effects on native peoples and the Chinese laborers, was a breathtaking moment in transit-oriented development envisioned by Abraham Lincoln. So the notion of using federal investment to spur development, I love it when people say transit doesn't spur development. Like, look at the Western United States, you know what I mean? So I had this notion that federal assets could play a huge role, right, in Washington, D.C. So when the Radnor family, Debbie and Al Radnor, made the big investment down at Southeast Federal, that you could see the potential in that. When President Clinton, to help the city out of the economic woes we were in back in the 90s, made the decision to move major Navy investment over from Arlington, Crystal City, where at that time, I think they had 2 or 3 trees over there, to move the Navy over to Southeast Federal Center. That was big. When Eleanor Holmes Norton made the courageous decision to move the ATF over to Noma, what is now Noma, huge decision. So you know, I think, and you were there, Norman, we could see the huge potential of that.
What type of resistance was there? Because was it just Eleanor, or who else? How did the stars align to allow ATF to move to Noma, EEOC to move to Noma, DOT to move to Capitol Riverfront?
I think, you know, a lot of people, they criticized me back at the time. They said, all we did was just take advantage of the opportunities he was presented. I'm like, yeah, duh, that's exactly what I did, you know? But, you know, it's harder to do than you think. And the opportunity was DC had tremendous potential. We had personal relationship with the President of the United States, who treated the mayor of DC like a member of the cabinet. I didn't go through intergovernmental relations and all these people. I could go directly to the Oval Office and Hillary. That made a huge difference for Washington, D.C. You saw what federal facilities could do elsewhere in the country. That made a huge, you know, difference for D.C. The opposition, there really wasn't a lot of opposition within the city itself, because people at that point were, let's try anything, you know what I mean? Right, so
you talked about federal facilities. To what extent was it kind of the location of ATF headquarters in Noma or EEOC headquarters in Noma? How much was it the federal presence versus other factors like Metro? You know, we look at Capitol Riverfront. How much of it was DOT versus the ballpark? You know, where do you think?
Well, I think Marcel could talk about the importance of visioning and planning, right? Without which we will perish. You know, people would say, why do you spend so much time on planning in the city? Because if we want to be a self-respecting city, we've got to do our own planning. No offense, we can't have the federal government do our planning for us. We got to, for the local city, not the assets like Pennsylvania Avenue and the monumental aspect of DC, which should be the NCPC. We have to have our own sense of ourselves. That's what planning is about, and we have to seize this opportunity. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to envision and get people to understand how these federal investments, one, fit into a broader vision for, in the case of ATF Noma, for a broader vision in the case of Southeast Waterfront, the Anacostia River vision, to move the focus of the world on DC from not just the mall, but to the entire DC, to move it from west to east. That was very important. And then lastly, to leverage these federal investments, whether it sounds like we knew what we were doing now when I talk about it, but to leverage these federal investments, we were actually just kind of doing stuff and hope it worked. But anyway, to leverage these federal investments in the case of ATF with the train station. So what we did with the train station, we essentially, along executive summaries, we essentially used a notion of tax increment, right? The developers in the city pledged incremental financing from the future to build the station now, knowing that taxes would go up, which they did manifold from that investment. To do that in Southwest Waterfront, we were collecting $8 million a year, 9 million maybe from Southwest Waterfront. We put in 10 million in incentives, and now we're collecting 90. The same thing with a baseball, leveraging the investments I talked about with Southeast Federal Center. So it was that seeing it in a vision and leveraging it with our own investments.
I'll ask the other panelists to jump in if they want to, but let me ask this question. We've talked, you want to share some thoughts?
I thought you wanted to say something.
All right, so we talked about ATF and EEOC and NOMA. We talked about DOT on the Capitol Riverfront. Let's talk about DHS headquarters at St. Elizabeth's. Is it having the same impact? Yes or no?
That's a really good question. I'm just getting back to Mayor Williams' comments. I think the issue with federal investments initially is really building confidence in the neighborhood, and also catalyst that these really were the key triggers to a wide scale revitalization of these areas. So I think that's the power of these sorts of investment. I think the issue that Norm raised was there are differences in the types of federal facilities that we have in our portfolio. So obviously those that are located on a single block that have engaged the pedestrian environment are great for revitalization efforts. But we do have a number of facilities like DHS at St. Elizabeth's, which are unsecured campuses. So it presents a physical barrier to the community from the onset. We also have examples of that in Acosta. I mean, the whole joint base Acosta bowling. So we have examples of federal facilities that are there for operational reasons that have a high security need, and by definition are fenced off and gated. And to some extent, those may have less of a relationship with the community, which I think is something we all need to think about when we try to figure out what sorts of federal uses are more compatible with community revitalization or not. But we do have a number that aren't. So I think that's one of the bigger picture questions that I think we need to consider as we kind of move the conversation forward.
And just quickly, I would add, it's not purely the investment itself, right, that does what we're trying to do. It's the invigoration of the area, it's the people, it's the activity, it's the other commerce that happens around it. And that's a lot of what we want to talk about today, is that that's not happening in the same way that it was from these federal buildings in these locations, because the foot traffic isn't there, the workforce isn't there. And so just the point is it's not just the dollars, it's the people and the activity that tends to beget other good things.
All right, so a couple decades of experience in the district where we've seen how these federal facilities really can be catalysts for neighborhood development. So we're going to fast forward to 2023. Back in July, GAO released a report on federal buildings utilization. How many in this room have read that report? Wow, pretty good. All right, so I'm going to turn the mic to Keith. Give us some headlines in terms of your approach on that study.
Yeah, thanks. Is this on? Yeah.
And tell me when you want me to move the slide.
Oh, not yet. Norm always brings me along to throw cold water on all this great news about fabulous things that are happening in the district. So yeah, let's put up the slide. So GEO did a report on the utilization of buildings. And in this report, we had to find a new way to measure utilization. So what we did was we went to the 24 CO fact agencies, all 24 volunteered to participate because they all knew they had a problem. And none of them wanted to be the one that people pointed out. And so what we did was we measured the number of people going into these buildings every day for a week in January, a week in February, and a week in March. And these were normal weeks. And nobody had done this. Agencies didn't have a sense of how to measure that. So we had to use, for the most part, badge swipes at the door. This is a security system. It's not designed to measure people. It's designed to just make sure the right people can get in and the wrong people can't. So they had to find ways to count that and deduplicate it for every time somebody went out for coffee or something like that. And it was hard. Some agencies didn't even have badge swipes. So we just had somebody at the front door with a clicker. And so this was brand new for these federal agencies. And it really took a lot of courage for them to participate. And that's the reason we lumped them in this way in the quartiles. OMB called it naming and blaming. If we say who's last, they're going to be last, even if first is no prize. So here are the results. So in the first quartile, you have utilization of around 9%. Now, the Washington Post, when they reported on this, initially got it wrong. They said 9% of the people are going to the office. That's not what this shows. This shows that the buildings are being used at 9% of the capacity. Almost all these buildings would not reach 100%, even if every single person at the agency went to the building. So what we're talking about are buildings that already had a lot of extra capacity. And this was just really, really made worse by the pandemic. Since the pandemic, all these agencies have embraced in some degree remote work, telework, hybrid work. Now, when you look at the quartiles, what you'll see on the left are agencies which are not front-facing, not public-facing. And on the far right, you're going to see agencies that have a lot of secure work. The people who are going to the work are the people who have to work in SCIFs or secure spaces for classified purposes. You still can't do that from home yet. And so that's basically the difference. But what you can see, and the message here is that every agency is having a problem. These buildings are almost completely unutilized. And this makes all these investments that Mayor Williams talked about very difficult to leverage.
So we've been struggling with this problem of utilization for years prior to COVID. First of all, one data point, one question is, all right, even pre-COVID, these buildings weren't at 100% because you had AWS, CWS, Monday and Fridays were much lighter than Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So on average, what do you think the pre-COVID occupancy was on the best day?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk to agencies, frankly, they would say that they were looking at 50, 60% maybe on the best day pre-COVID. Now, we didn't measure that because we didn't want this to become a back to the office kind of argument. We wanted to talk about the buildings and focus on getting these buildings more utilized. And, you say this is a problem going back, and it is a problem. It's been on a high risk list for 20 years. It's a long time, my whole geo career. And so one of the reasons is because of underutilized buildings. And it's tricky because if a building is completely empty, like the Georgetown power plant or the Cotton Annex, Flavio and his staff at GSA, they can get rid of those. They can sell those pretty easily. The problem is not the empty buildings. The problem is the mostly empty buildings, the underutilized buildings, because people still need to go to the Department of Transportation. We can't just get rid of the Department of Transportation building entirely. So it's when it's underutilized, that's when the real problems begin.
Let me ask our panelists here, as you read the report, what were your impressions?
I think we want to be careful and think about what are we really trying to solve here. We could see this as a problem or an opportunity, right? In terms of the federal footprint and what is it, what kinds of buildings do we have and what are they used for? That's one set of problems and issues that has existed for a long time. There's another problem about the city and its need to have foot traffic and revitalized communities. And that's a completely different problem, I would say. Just by a show of hands, how many of you go into an office to go to work? How many of you go every day? I go every day because President Biden wants me to come every day. and I take the metro. And sometimes it's really full and sometimes it's not. So the reality is, one more show of hands, how many of you did like a Zoom or a WebEx or God forbid, Microsoft Teams call in the last week? All three. I mean, they're so different, right? But I mean, I'm just saying, like, this is a reality that many cities are facing. And I would argue that that's a little bit different from what do we do with federal space, and we should have that conversation. And I applaud GAO and their work here, because that's a building by building and a kind of a different kind of thing that we're also working on. We're working on both in the federal government, but we're taking an approach that is really about the outcomes for our federal mission. And that is what we want to base any, telework or, come into the building kind of policy on. But we also know that there's a building issue as well, and we're working on that too.
But to get back to, well, first of all, totally support the president, applaud the, you guys at the White House and OMB for the direction to get more federal workers back to DC. But what responsibility does the federal government have that, say, not to make it too grandiose, we'll skip Lincoln, but that President Carter had, that the federal presence is important to cities. How important is that? And I mean, I see this as a political issue for the president. I see the Republicans using this as a cudgel, saying, all these people, we're paying all these people all this, and they don't even come to work, even though they are working. That's what they're going to say. That's to you, Nani.
I know.
Yeah,
Okay, I'll just say one thing about that. That's like, to me, that's noise. The reality is that federal employees are coming to work. The issue, as we see it, this particular issue is specific to DC, New York, San Francisco, and very large cities. And I would argue that the community development issue and the revitalization issue has to do with areas where you just have a large concentration of office buildings and no one's coming, not even private sector folk, right? And so that to me is, again, a particular thing. In the field, we are seeing people showing up for work. We have all of our offices open, the offices that people care about, right? Like going to Social Security Administration, there people still want to do that work in person. So I do think that is a fun political argument, but I actually don't see the federal government stepping away from investment in cities. And also, I don't see the federal government removing its, headquarter footprint where it is. I just think we need to be a little more smart about how we do that work if we really want to do right by the mission that we're trying to accomplish and the workforce that we've got.
Yeah, I'll be the guy to take a slightly different view, maybe, which is to say, as a taxpayer, I do believe fundamentally that in-person work, things like today, being in person with people is better. And so whether it's what it does to our city, or what as a taxpayer it does to the effectiveness of this workforce that we're all paying for, I do want people back to the office. For me, it is a little bit more about getting people back to the office. And I'm not going to sit up here and say that I think every federal worker is going to be back 5 days a week anytime soon, or maybe ever. But I do think we should continue to focus on that for its effectiveness for the workforce that we all pay for.
All right, Pete, while you have the floor, let's focus a little bit more on some of the urban impacts that we've been talking about.
Great. So I have the unenviable task of trying to predict what's going to happen with federal real estate, and then to predict what that's going to do for private sector real estate. So with that as my task, I'll throw a couple of stats at you and just sort of some thoughts that I have. So I think we're in the early innings of this. Leases tend to be long-term. There've been, when leases have rolled, there's been short-term extensions. So we haven't really seen a lot of impacts from what the federal real estate footprint, how it's going to change, what it's actually going to do. But looking forward, obviously, if you think that there is going to be a major shift in how the federal workforce uses real estate or the federal real estate footprint, the potential impact to the DC market is quite large. And the stats that give me the confidence to say that is that, you know, the slide says 54.3 million square feet of leased or owned space in the district alone. That's a massive amount of square footage. And if you take leased and owned space across the region, it's 93 million square feet, or over 26% of all of the privately owned, leased, or GSA owned space in the DMV. So if you think there's going to be even a 10% reduction in that, is 2.6 million square feet. Is 9.3 million square feet on the market. So depending on what you think the impacts are, or what the change is going to be, there are some significant impacts out there. There's a lot of different views on how the federal footprint is going to change. I think there's a couple of things that give people who are in the real estate business a little bit of confidence. And that is that there's been a historical inertia against dealing with this. Keith said we've been talking about this for decades. I think a second is there's going to be some reticence on behalf of these agencies to give up space without really knowing what the future is going to look like. And then the third I would mention is a lot of these agencies have historically had their own space and not wanted to share it with someone else within the federal government, meaning whether it's a security issue or whatever. The fact that you could take 200,000 square foot users and put them in a 200,000 square foot building in the federal space is less likely. They like having their own space. So if you want to look for some bright spots, those are the kind of things that we think about as to, you know, kind of how this might be a lesser impact as opposed to a greater one. If you'll flip forward, Norm. So I do think it's instructive also to think about when this could happen. And so this data is all CBREs, by the way. So if it's not good, you can blame them. But so just in terms of when these expire, when these leases expire. So through 2029, I think it says 5 years. That's actually 6 if you're a math guy. But through 2029, there's 37, almost 38 million square feet of expiring leases in the region, and that's 30 leases greater than 200,000 square feet. So this is something that, you know, again, there's been a historical preference for short-term extensions and things like that, but there is an awful lot of expiration in the near term that we're going to have to deal with. So next slide shows what I think is, if you want to take a positive or a more positive view of this, this is some data that we like to think about. It is challenging to really draw a parallel between the federal workforce and the private sector workforce other than federal contractors. I think they tend to look more like and act more like the federal workforce than the pure private sector employee. But this is daily distinct users between March of 2020 and October of 2023 in three of our major markets. And off to the right, I'll talk about DC in a minute. But in New York, it's 95% of back to where it was daily distinct users in our New York portfolio. It is often held as the sort of star in terms of back to work, and our data shows that. Boston is not far behind at 3/4 of pre-pandemic. And San Francisco, not surprisingly, is with all the tech workforce, is low. We don't have great data in DC. One of the reasons that the Castle data is a relatively small footprint. This is their biggest market, and just for reference, they're in one BXP building in this market. So whose data they have, and like we use it because that's what we have, but it isn't the be all and end all. And I'm not being negative on the Castle data. It is at least good as a comparison to itself, but it has limitations to it. We don't have great data on our DC footprint. There aren't we don't have turnstiles in all of our buildings, so we don't have great data. We think it's somewhere probably close to Boston, maybe not quite as good as Boston, but definitely better than the West Coast. So there is good data out there. We talk a lot about the bifurcation between the best buildings in the market and how they're performing versus everything else. And, that's with a little bit of humility, those are our buildings, we think, and this data is obviously very positive. So the last thing I'll just touch on is, why do we care about this? And, I alluded to it in my first comment, which is to say, people on the street, and I would not by any means seek to say that the federal workforce not being back in the office is the cause of these things on the screen. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that they are correlated in some way. And these statistics are not great. And so if you pick one of those, whether it's the crime, whether it's the fiscal issues, there are things that matter. And why I personally, and I think a lot of people in the real estate space think that this is a really important issue, that physically getting not just the federal workforce, but it is a large portion of the workforce in DC, getting people back to their offices is pretty important. So I'll stop there.
All right, let me pose a question to the group. We've been talking about return to the office. We've been talking about underutilized buildings. Should we be focusing on returning employees to the office, or should we recognize that we're in a fundamentally different place and that we need to be more thoughtful in terms of how we reposition some of these assets? I think you want to get a word in.
Yeah, no, I would try to figure out. Define how, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people in DC feel this way. The way to think about it is, we talked about how when President Clinton moved Navy assets over, the powerful positive effect that had. The way a lot of us think about this is basically one of the largest base closings in American history. So treated like a base closing. So whatever we had before and wherever we end up, whatever the difference is, you could define as a base closing, and what we should say, okay, we're only going to get so much in terms of people back, and the difference the federal government should make to us as an investment to help us diversify our economy, right? And pick up, same thing we did with Alameda in Oakland, Treasure Island in San Francisco. We could go down the list. You know, the big when Navy pulled out of Pearl Harbor, huge, investment in Hawaii. We should be looking to do that in DC to help us diversify our economy and bring in other backfill.
Yeah, you might remember from my bio that I studied base closure for a long time in Germany, and people were always panicking, a lot like we see today about the base closure. But what they almost always found out is 20 years later, it was like Nats Park. It was better than it ever was before. Federal investment in that way really does not have a great multiplier. You talk about Bolling Air Force Base. What's the multiplier there? Even St. Elizabeth, not a lot of people are leaving those secure spaces to go into the neighborhoods at all. And if you've been in Federal Center Southwest, even before the pandemic, it wasn't what I call a bustling neighborhood. It was all federal buildings, and for most part, low-end stuff. And so what I think this is an opportunity, and a lot of these buildings have passed their useful life. Congress has not invested the money that's needed to keep them up. They're not modern, they're not configured properly. And so even if everybody went back to the office, they couldn't be completely productive. I'll admit that I'm more productive at home because my tech is better. So these are the sorts of things that provide an opportunity right now to reinvest in the buildings we're going to keep and get rid of the ones that have no longer a useful life. And we'll be better in the future.
Nani.
I'll just say a few things. I mean, again, this is a broader problem that we've been thinking about. We just last week put out a real estate conversion, office to housing conversion playbook and fact sheet. A lot of interesting ideas in there. That is a signal that we're actually going to continue to work on that. We're doing convenings, we're talking to folks about this, but really also unlocking some of the federal dollars and showing the way in the playbook to use those dollars to do some actually office conversions. Those are really hard to do. You guys all know way more about that than I do. There's local zoning issues, there's use of the building issues. Some of these buildings are old and can't be easily converted, but it is actually a step in the direction of what do you do when you have a neighborhood where there are a lot of not just federal, but other empty office buildings, and how can you revitalize that neighborhood? We know we still have very high rent here, and we have a housing crunch at every income level, and that's been the case for a long time. So that's one direction in which we're moving.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a yes, and I think we have to encourage the federal workforce to get back into the buildings and think about what we do with underutilized real estate. And I agree with what Keith said. Many times when a base closure or whatever, a federal a building moves out of a market, it becomes better over time, but it is A, over time, and B, it's because it was really thoughtfully planned, and it doesn't just happen. So I do think this is a all of government, all of society kind of effort towards lessening the impact on the city. I really do.
Well, actually, Southeast Waterfront is actually a story of both leveraging the investment of the Navy over there and the retreat of some other federal assets. So it's really a story of both, doing both. I mean, what Forest City did was great repurposing of what had been federal presence. You see what I mean? So it's, yeah, two stories, yeah.
All right, I want to take the conversation in a slightly different direction now. We've been talking about utilization, we've been talking about underutilization of federal buildings. But next, I want to explore the distinction between federal use of a property versus highest and best use of the asset. And having been watching this movie for more than a decade, it seems like we conflate the two. We assume that as long as the federal government is using the property, that's highest and best use. And I know I've had a lot of debates with folks, some who are in this room, about the distinction between the two. But, you know, sometimes I think that when the federal government contemplates whether to dispose or retain of a property in its portfolio, it's just focusing on that narrow question of whether an agency is using the property, instead of considering whether the agency use of the property represents the most productive use of the site, and considering that, hey, even though I have this agency in this federal building, there may be other ways of meeting that agency's housing requirement. Not everybody needs to be co-located in this federal building in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I can take those agencies and put them into different leases, and I can put that property back on the market for more productive use. I'm talking about Portsmouth as an example because that was a real life example that we dealt with at GSA. So want to kind of, in my observations, it seems like as you focus just on that narrow question of whether the building is being used, and I'm only going to dispose of the stuff that I'm not using, it's a little bit of a garage sale mentality that may not be the most thoughtful way of managing your real estate portfolio. So I wanted to shift gears and ask Marcel to share some thoughts on where you see federal use of properties that may not be highest and best use, that may not be realizing the true potential of that site.
Well, thanks so much, Norm. First of all, I'm an optimist about cities. Cities are resilient places that we are going through a major transition today, and we have to both work on the short and long term of it all. But we've also had a lot of experience over time in terms of repurposing federal assets to a better use. So federal use and best use are not necessarily synonymous in a lot of situations. So if you go to the next slide, you know. Oh, yeah. Oh. Yeah. So just in terms of some of the things that we've done, GSA's work in terms of repurposing the old post office building to a hotel, for instance, a Hotel Monaco sits at the old general post office building. We also have great museums like the Portrait Gallery, which was in the old patent office buildings. Those were early examples of transformation of these assets where, yes, those uses of those agencies moved to more productive and modern space, but it kind of left an opening for the city to kind of re-envision those spaces. So we have in this area, we have Gallery Place and the Portrait Gallery and the arena together kind of recreated a different sense of place for Pennsylvania, for a Penn Quarter. So I think that's kind of a lesson that we all should kind of take in terms of how repurposing federal assets could lead to a better community or to a better city. Even in terms of the FBI building, you know, if and when they relocate from Pennsylvania Avenue, I recall Norm and I sat down in 2016 to talk about what the future is of that site. The best use of that site on Pennsylvania Avenue may not be another federal agency. We have all agreed that if it does change, it should be mixed use. It should be something that contributes back to the vitality of the city. In fact, the city is looking at trying to repopulate downtown. So housing development there over time may be an important asset to downtown revitalization. So in that case, the repurposing of that federal land, that federal asset, if and when FBI moves, is an important part of city redevelopment. And so it's kind of thinking through how does that asset fit into the longer goals of that community that I think is really essential, especially when we're thinking about what the future is of downtown DC. So if you go to the next slide, we talked a lot about BRAC, the Base Realignment and Closure Act, but this has been a long ongoing process in this region. We have a huge defense footprint in Washington, DC. So I think the mayor brought up the whole notion of what happened to Crystal City, because they had a huge amount of federal back office functions in Crystal City. 17,000 employees had to leave and be relocated to a variety of different bases in the region and out of the region. 4 million square feet of office space had to be repurposed after they left. So we now think of Crystal City as a wonderful place to go. With Amazon, it's now coming in. The city had to do a lot of homework, or the county had to do a lot of homework in terms of figure out a way to repurpose that community to become what it is today. But if you were here 50 years ago, there was very dire talk about the future of Arlington, the future of Pentagon City, the future of Crystal City. So I think just to put this in perspective, I do think, cities are resilient, communities are resilient. Even as part of that BRAC closure, we got Walter Reed. And that whole base moved from a government operational efficiency standpoint, merging with the Navy hospital in Bethesda made a lot of sense. But it did allow us to reuse that land in a way and reclaim that land in a way that better suited the community in terms of meeting the housing goals of the district. So I just think in terms of kind of looking at how this plays out, we've had a lot of experience. We have a lot of examples, and that we can really do, if we really thought carefully about this, there are great opportunities for the city and kind of our futures.
Gio's work really backs everything you say up. It really does bring in more. If you think about the FBI building right now, it's a dead zone for restaurants or anything to do. You have to basically keep walking for a long block just to get to anywhere else to do or see anyone else. And I think the Walter Reed thing got us our first Wegmans, right?
Yeah, I think there's a good body of, I believe it was ULI that put out a study that really looked at foot traffic and how has retail done. And it was pretty definitive that areas that are mixed use have performed better since the pandemic than areas that are singular focus. And that can be just office, but I think it might even be worse if it's just federal office, especially in 2023. So I think there's a good, I agree with everything that was said. I think the federal footprint shrinking could be a good thing if done sort of thoughtfully and from a planning perspective and all those kinds of things. But sort of Finance 101 says when interest rates do what they've done today, every financial asset is worth less. If you discount the cash flows at a higher interest rate, they're worth less. Economics 101 would say that supply and demand is a real thing, right? And so if too much supply of excess federal real estate comes on at the wrong time, it's bad for the market. It's also bad for us as taxpayers in terms of sort of getting the best value out of the disposition of that real estate. So I do think it has to be planned and measured and thoughtful.
And include reinvestment in what we do keep. I think that's one of the key elements.
Marcel, can you just take a minute to talk about the work you're doing in terms of the future visioning for Pennsylvania Avenue? You talked about the FBI building, but talk more broadly about kind of the larger federal presence along that avenue and what people are thinking about for the future.
Well, yeah, it's a hugely important street in terms of both the district, in terms of being a place where a lot of people go to for a variety of festivals and other activities, but also it's an important street for the nation. And so we do see its future in terms of being less of a street that carries cars and more of a multimodal transportation corridor that actually functions as a venue. And that to the extent that many of these activities that go on the mall today, in terms of large festivals, things can go onto Pennsylvania Avenue and have a more direct relationship to downtown DC, I think would benefit everyone. So in terms of just re-envisioning how this space is used, it could be an asset as opposed to a barrier between the mall and downtown DC. So it's really kind of rethinking that. And also how we use assets like FBI, I think are going to be really critical to that in terms of what that development looks like in the future. The Johns Hopkins University coming in most recently, I think is a great opportunity to kind of rethink the nature of that street.
All right, so I see a lot of my former colleagues from the executive branch in the audience, and as folks in the executive branch know, all roads lead back to OMB. So I want to give Nani an opportunity just to share some perspective on these issues. And I'll come back to a point that we were talking about before, and that is there's no question about the administration's commitment to cities, to reviving our nation's cities, particularly in the aftermath of the pandemic. We saw billions of dollars in financial assistance through the American Rescue Plan, so clearly full-throated embrace and support for America's cities. At the same time, we have been seeing this impact in terms of the federal presence and what has happened to our cities post-pandemic. So I wanted to kind of ask you to talk about how this issue of federal workplace flexibility comports with the administration's larger commitment to our nation's cities and the administration's urban agenda.
Sure. So we've been doing quite a lot of work on workplace flexibility, but also on organizational health is how we talk about it. And part of it is taking the lessons learned from the pandemic and taking the lessons learned that about working in today's environment, and all of the people who raised their hands and said that we really don't come in every day. And so we're really asking agencies to update their workforce plans with an eye towards accomplishing their mission. We also, though, at the same time, think that meaningful in-person work, particularly at headquarters, is important, and we have made no kind of secret of that. So we think it's critical to the well-being of our teams, but we also still think we can harness enhanced flexibilities that we've all learned how to use in the pandemic. So it is really a both and approach, and it is very nuanced. And the one thing we are doing at OMB is we're actually using that planning effort that's happening in the human capital and the management and leadership communities in the federal government, and we're having it inform our capital planning. So we've picked back up the mantle of having a capital planning effort, and it is involving not just the federal real property community, but our human capital community, our financial community, and so forth. And OMB creates and sets the table for that alongside GSA and others to really sort of have those conversations about our own internal planning and what we think is important to have a federal workforce working and delivering on the mission that's important. We are also making lots of investment into cities. You mentioned the recovery plan, but just for the bipartisan infrastructure law, as of September, there's a $1.5 billion coming in DC. And most of that is in transportation, but that is real money, and there's more to come behind that, because that law has a long tail, and it is aimed at investing in retooling our own infrastructure with a focus on resilience, sustainability, but also on transportation, and making sure that we're investing in assets that are already here. So it is really a both and approach here about trying to have the right kind of sort of sustainable workforce in the office when they need to be. And I'll just say, we're also looking at a whole bunch of other things, the kinds of things that we looked at when I was at Treasury. And when I was at Treasury, we used the Castle card data to figure out how many people were coming into main headquarters Treasury, but we also just had people on random days of the week walk around and count how many empty offices there were, how many people were in the office. And this was in, 2012, right? And so we kind of figured out that Tuesday was the day that most people were in, but we probably still had over half of the desks not full. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that these things don't move very quickly, but we are actually already seeing progress. If you look at Metro data, it's actually ticking up every week and every month. And so we're expecting to see that continue throughout the fall and winter. But we are definitely in a world where we're working on both and it is a different world of working. If you want to, recruit, retain the best workforce, you really have to be agile here.
Keith.
Quick follow-up. Earlier you mentioned the housing shortage, and it's a big topic today, is office building conversions to residential, but it's hard. Not every building is suited for it. It's expensive. Do you think this is a private sector solution, or do you think the government has a role in helping spur some of these conversions?
I mean, I think it's both. Again, the documents we put out last week on whitehouse.gov, I talked to some of the people who worked on that. That is a signal that we want to give that the federal government is coming with whatever flexibility and funding that we have. So one of the funding sources that actually has its own playbook, the Department of Transportation for office to residential conversion is TIFIA, if you're familiar with that. That's $35 billion of funding. Look, it's existing funding, but when an agency like DOT signals that they're looking at this, what they really mean is you're going to start seeing it and notices of funding opportunities. You're going to start asking for this, giving preference points to these kinds of things. None of that has happened yet, but that's the kinds of things that we envision. HUD also has done a lot of work on this. They are currently soliciting funding for studying residential, office to residential conversion so that they can create an evidence base for what works. And in their part of this playbook, they actually show capital stack on deals where we really are funding pieces. HUD is funding pieces of office to residential conversion. All this takes a long time. You just heard Crystal City is 15 years ago was, and here we are today. So, and Tony Williams also said, these things take a long time, but it helps to broaden the aperture about what we're trying to solve here. And the federal government wants to be a part of that solution for sure.
All right, we're going to take questions in about 3 minutes, but I'm going to end with one final question for the panelists. You mentioned about how these things take time. One of my observations is the task will expand to fit the time allotted. So we've been talking about underutilized federal properties for about 200 years now, right? And you're hearing a little bit of frustration in my voice because we have been talking about it forever. So given this massive amount of utilization, the GAO report is eye-opening. What do we do? And Tony, I'm going to start with you. A, how would you think about this massive problem? And B, how do you create a sense of urgency so we're not having the same conversation 10 years from now?
I think that, for the federal government, attention to governmental management, control issues, ebbs and flows. So I was CFO, Department of Agriculture. That was a moment when Congress was really actually focused on management. And, Alice Rivlin had done the Budget Act, and that was whole part of an era of they really cared about government. I think they're going to break out of their fever, and they're going to once again try to do things, and we should seize that opportunity. And I actually am an optimist. I actually think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And then I think it's also the cities and counties, governors really not coming to the White House with 40 things, but 1 or 2 things that get at these issues that can help move the needle as well. Because, everybody's got plate is overflowing. So we really need to be selective and intentional about what we're asking, given all the dynamics for the federal government to do. Now, could I also thank you for getting the deputy director of OMB here? That's really impressive. I mean, talk about follow the money. We've got a lady here who can write checks that don't bounce. So this is impressive.
Other thoughts on this question? Not the money question, but
So I have some thoughts. I would say, you could really jumpstart some of this by just fully funding the federal buildings fund. You also have a question I think you're going to ask, which is like, what can we do? We really need to actually say what the effect of diverting that funding has been. It has been a degradation of the buildings that we're trying to actually improve the efficiency. And so, I would say our FY24 budget request, we are still, fighting for that, and also FY24 funding. In general, we do need to fund the government right now, but there's a $2.3 billion capital program request in there that is really important to address some of the issues we're talking about. There's also legislative proposals, no cost proposals that we put in there to allow for flexibility to access funds in different ways. Flexibilities in what you use the expenses, disposal, surplus, real and related personal property appropriation for. These are not asking necessarily for more money, but they're asking to give GSA some more tools to be able to do the right thing here. And I think GSA is, I know Norm was at GSA, they're working, they're trying, and no one is ever fully, happy with the results there, but there are tools there, and if we give them more tools, I think more can be done in the direction that we need, but we really need to stop diverting funding out of the buildings fund.
Keith.
Yeah, thanks. You're exactly right, Norm. This has been going on too long. And I think that Congress, with our report, has started to get the message. Now that we have a speaker, I have reviewed 5 pieces of draft legislation that they're getting ready to drop, real property reform legislation. So if the agencies don't start taking action, Congress is going to come up behind them and give them a kick in the pants. Some of the things they're looking at are requiring agencies for new space requirements to use utilization, not the number of people assigned to the building, number of people entering the building. That's how much space they need. Other things are requiring agencies to look at joint location. Peter said that they are reluctant to share. But then you also described a situation where the Army and the Navy, who are not great at working together, managed to have a joint hospital, better for everyone. So they're going to force agencies to get over this kind of hump of sharing space. And also, just like, if you're not going to use it up above to a certain standard, start talking about disposal. So these changes are coming. I think Congress has finally gotten the message, at least on that. On fully funding the federal buildings fund, I'm not sure about that one.
All right, it's now time for questions and conversation with the audience. We have folks with microphones, so if you've got a question, raise your hand. We'll come to you with a microphone. Why don't we go to the woman right there on the end?
Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. My name is Dr. Myrtle Alexander. Our institute is the Institute for Academic Management. I stem from the UK and Switzerland, and our problem right now is locating a building. I'm sitting here, and my colleagues don't understand how you cannot find a building for education to workforce in Washington, DC. We look at Washington, DC as the capital of the world. And then I saw the figures with underutilization, and I'm quite staggered, really. So I'd like to speak to each of you individually, because we do have a model for an institute. Pennsylvania Avenue will take the FBI building, no problem. Seriously. And we'll put it to good use. And we're talking education from 0 to 80 years old for education to workforce via apprenticeships, dual education, dual enrollment. And it just makes absolute sense. So thank you very much. And if you're looking to join a board, we're actually taking on board members. So thank you for an amazing presentation.
Thank you for those comments. Why don't we go right here?
I don't need a mic. All right, okay. I've never needed a mic. I wanted to follow up on something Mayor Williams said. I've been working on the disposition of a military fort. It's 1,200 acres. And because of the work you did in Southeast DC with the Navy Yard and all the work with the waterfront plan, we worked with the organization to market to the community and keep the community informed. And that's partly been my job. We just sold the last 300 acres to Netflix. It's going to be an interesting process. My question is, what is the role of the federal government in doing that? And how do you keep the community informed because of this 200-year process so that you don't have the frustration? You know, the FBI building is a good example. So particularly to you, I would ask, what is your role?
The FBI building is a great example. As you all know, DC has quite a lot of strings leading back to Congress. And Congress has opinions on where the FBI building should go, and they always have. And so the GSA has done their level best to kind of navigate that, but it has served to delay. And, you know, also when we change presidents, things change also, right? Like plans get pulled, things get delayed. And so that's the difficulty, I think, here. I think somebody like Norm could probably answer this question better when you're talking about on the ground federal buildings at GSA, interaction with community, because, you know, that is a real, you know, community by community effort, particularly when you're talking about something like disposition of federal land. So I'll maybe let Norm take that question a little bit.
All right, I'm looking here at Frank Giblin and Karen Hensfeld from the GSA's Good Neighbor Program. I will just say I've been really impressed and thrilled with the work that you've been doing at GSA. And I think it's an example of how the federal government should be engaging with local government on these questions. So GSA has the team and the apparatus to do this. Granted, it's hard to kind of cover the entire landscape, but I'm always impressed with the thoughtfulness of the approach that you guys have taken at GSA. All right, David Winstead has a question.
Thank you. A great panel, Mayor. Nice to see you and everybody else. It's really for Marcel, but it gets the mayor's calling for action. And I think the facts show that we need to take action. But Marcel, I know that NCPC and the district planning has always had a vision of opening up L'Enfant Plaza. You know, really making that connection between the Smithsonian to the new waterfront. We have a situation, your slide, Keith, showed that the DOE is about 20% utilization. You have the Forrestal building that blocks that view. Back to the vision issue, what opportunity does that present? I mean, they're underutilized landmark buildings in the Federal Triangle, and you have an opportunity here that maybe near-term action could take place.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we're talking about federal real estate, we also need to think about future expansion needs of our cultural assets like the Smithsonian. So there are 4 Smithsonian museums that are kind of on the table right now. And the question is, where do you put them over time? So one of the things that we've been kind of deliberating about is kind of like if federal buildings do leave, or I mean federal agencies do consolidate, or there are changes in the area, there needs to be a reservoir of sites available for cultural uses, because being the nation's capital also means that you provide those sorts of public spaces and public buildings that are important. And also in the long term, how do you connect kind of the mall to the Southwest waterfront? There's a lot of great activity there. We even see the Spy Museum locating there. So at some point in time, the notion of this becoming a cultural corridor, an extension of the Smithsonian, to some extent makes a lot of sense from that perspective. So I think, you know, as we're thinking about freeing up assets over time, that's a hugely important one, at least for the federal government in terms of future federal uses and how that relates to that area.
We're going to go, actually, Julia.
Good morning. Thank you. Wonderful panel. I actually have about 512 questions, but I'll ask one. I kind of want, I'm from the labor department. I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the federal worker in these conversations, because there's a lot of things that are sort of playing off of each other. As somebody who came in during the pandemic every day and is still coming in, rode the metro except for when it was closed, lives in DC and is a DC taxpayer, I take all these things sort of on a personal level, but on a professional level, across the country, I've got tens of thousands of people going into these offices. When you talk about the crime rate going up, but you want to bring people back, like, what do you do? And is there actually a tipping point? So if these revitalization efforts do not work, and we do not, and actually things start going backwards, and the buildings, those Whole Foods that were coming and start pulling out of the neighborhoods, and these things are happening, you have a workforce that is really disinclined to come in. And frankly, you have leadership that doesn't feel like they should ask them to feel like cannon fodder going into unsafe neighborhoods. So don't know if anybody has thoughts on that.
I know that's a real issue for DOL at the Nancy Pelosi building
It is.
in San Francisco.
Very much so. Yes. Thank you.
So the way I look at it is the public realm. We're talking about the city and the public realm. You can have a nice vision for the public realm, like the Acosta Waterfront Initiative is an example, but the public realm has to be founded first and foremost on settled expectations. Where the federal government comes in, this is all my opinion, but where the federal government comes in is you can't get more settled expectations in the federal government. So that's good. It may not be as dynamic and fancy, but it's like a long-term commitment. That's great. Public safety is also a matter of public expectations. You've got to have a safe environment, right? It's got to be, you got to feel safe. You got to feel like, you're welcomed. All that is very, very important. I would totally agree that unless public safety is addressed, all of this is really hypothetical and theoretical. I would totally agree, which is why my organization, we're mounting a major effort to turn the tanker back on public safety, because I think, frankly, and I'm, proud to be a blue person in a blue state, but I think we overreacted, and I think we need to, set the needle back. I remember back in the 90s, I don't remember ever going to a meeting where people say they wanted less police, so, we just need to focus on that. You're totally right. Anybody?
Other questions? I don't remember your name from last week, but Peter.
Thanks, Norman. Thank you to the panel. So I work in infrastructure development. I guess my question might be for Nani, really. Considering that there's so much legacy policy and funding and built environment that has been developed on the assumption of traditional urban economics patterns, and now the modern economy is kind of showing us that those assumptions aren't permanent. So is there an awareness of that we need to make sure that all our funding, our policies reflect investment in today's economy, not yesterday's?
Yes. I would say yes. Look, we're the federal government, right? But our funding does go to local communities, and so there is an acknowledgement, particularly at the biggest grant making programs that you have at Housing and Urban Development, and I'm thinking in particular about the community development block grant funds, which are directly to cities, right, to do a whole flexible set of things. And also the Department of Transportation grants that I mentioned before, those go directly to projects. There is an acknowledgement by leadership and also by what they're starting to put into their notices of funding opportunities that if you want to get this grant money, you have to take more modern approaches to your planning and community input, as you were saying before. So I do think there's definitely at the leadership level, and it's starting to make its way into funding, an acknowledgement of that. And we have done this before. I mean, the work that Mayor Williams did has reverberating effects today, as we've been talking about. No one could have guessed back in 1994, when I was first here for just a few years, that the city would be what it is today. And that's how long it takes, right? So I would say not to give up, but absolutely where we can find best practices, where we are asking for community input and asking people to, quite frankly, take a look at sustainability and resilience and some of the issues that we were not dealing with in 1994, but are dealing with now in terms of what the city footprints are. We're putting that into all of the funding requests and the kinds of infrastructure investments that we're trying to make.
All right, we got time for one more question. Way back there. Yes, congratulations.
Thank you, Norm. I won. Good morning, everybody. Martine Combal from JLL. Thank you for a great panel. I wanted to make a couple of comments and also hear from the panel that I think aligns to some closing thoughts about incentives and just aligning parties. So prior to joining JLL, I was the Walter Reed Local Redevelopment Authority Director. Negotiated with the U.S. Army and undertook the finalization of the base reuse plan, as well as the solicitation and the selection of the master development. And I think one piece that I wanted to make apparent is that took about over $6 million of grants from DoD's Office of Economic Adjustment, which I know has a new name, in supporting the District of Columbia in those planning and development studies. And I think as we're talking about these large federal assets, we know consolidations, planning, it takes money to save money. So I would love to hear from the panel about thoughts about incentives, tools, policy changes on that point.
Well, I'm living in purgatory right now in advance. I'm the chairman of the DC Tax Revision Commission. It's hard because when we had the Tax Revision Commission 10 years ago, it was in an era of skyrocketing revenue growth. It's easy to do a tax commission then. It's really hard to do one now. And one of the battles we're having is about incentives. What are the right incentives? How do you evaluate and estimate incentives in a public environment? And all I'll say is, I think if the incentives are seated, again, in the right vision, in the right context of safety and order in a vibrant public realm, I think incentives in DC can work. I do. A great example would be, I mentioned the Southwest waterfront. We made incentives, the incentives work. We made investments in the ballpark over near Southeast waterfront. Everybody said it would be a disaster, the end of the world. The debt was being paid way ahead of schedule. And everybody who was against the stadium is robbing the repayment to pay for other things. So incentives can definitely work. NOMA is another example, but they have to be seated in the right kind of context.
Thank you so much.
No?
We're at time. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers. What an amazing conversation, incredible insights. I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of Georgetown. Thank you, Norm, for pulling this together and expert moderation. And thanks to all of you for coming in person to this meeting. And we'll be circulating a video of this for ongoing use, but thanks again to everyone.